Hey guys, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today we're going to wrap up the build of this Ka-Bar Tribute knife that I've been working on for quite a while now. Okay, we're back with the final installment of our Mosaic Damascus Ka-Bar knife build. When we left off, we just finished shaping the blade. Here's a view of where we're heading. Today we'll show the woodwork, heat treating, polishing to reveal the pattern in the steel, and then the final assembly of this knife. Like I said in the earlier video, there's a sting in the tail of this story and a somewhat shocking ending. So definitely stick around for that. Alright, let's jump into the build. Now that I've got the blade roughed out, I'll need to start making the handle. I'll be using this piece of spectacular stabilized burl wood. What kind of burl? Don't know. I went up to Peach State Lumber last year and they had this giant pile of burls. What's this one? Something from Mexico. That's all they knew. So anyway, Mexican burl. Beautiful stuff though. I stabilized it myself because burls love to blow up on you if you're not careful. They move a lot. They're just bad to work with if they're not stabilized. I guess I should have mentioned the handle will be turned on a lathe. The original was made out of stacked leather, but since this is wood, got to go a whole different direction. But first, I'll mill out the slot in which the tang nests. In order to do that, I'll cut the blank on my bandsaw, flatten it, then carefully mill it to fit the tang. First, a slot for the tang proper. Then the pommel will get threaded on, so a short section that's milled with a 1/4 inch end mill for that. Then a tiny little slot with a 1/32 inch cutter. The point of that is just so that I know exactly where the ends are when I turn this. See, if I don't turn it concentric to the slot, then the handles will be totally out of whack and all this work will be wasted. I'll have to just start over, scrap this nice piece of wood. Now glue them up, clamp them, and leave them overnight. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn the handle. I'm a decent knife maker, but my wood turning skills are pretty minimal. So my main goal here is just to go super slow and not screw up. The shape's pretty simple, so it's just a matter of taking measurements and not stampeding to the finish line. Once I've got the basic shape, I'll measure for the grooves that are a big part of the Ka-Bar look. Then gently dink them in with a little gouge I made years ago. Then I'll run up through the various grits of sandpaper, breathe a sigh of relief, and go inside to reward myself with a stiff cocktail for not blowing up such a nice piece of wood. Now I'll do some hand sanding. I'm not aiming for perfection here. Heat treating is going to add scale, and it actually causes the two different kinds of steel to expand in slightly different ways. So I don't need to go crazy here. I just want to get rid of the heavy grind marks on the bevels. Now it's time to quench the blade. I'll use my heat treating oven, heating the blade to 1500 Fahrenheit, then quenching it in a fast quenching oil. Then it's tempered at 400 Fahrenheit for a couple of cycles. Now every bladesmith's favorite part, sanding. This time I'm aiming to get things as perfect as I can get with hand sanding. I'll start by cleaning out the fullers. I start with 320 grit wrapped around a little Delrin rod that exactly matches the radius of the fuller. I didn't inflict too much of the sanding of this thing on you in the earlier part of this video, but getting it smooth and especially getting the little end sections nice and clean takes a lot of finickeration. You know, I'm not a super finicky guy by nature, so this kind of thing is torture for me, but you gotta do it. Pencil eraser and a tiny piece of sandpaper. Then I'm dumping some 600 grit loose abrasives in there, creating a paste with oil, and then dinking around with it with the pencil eraser until it's cleaned and shiny with no visible sanding scratches. On to the main job. As usual, I do some sanding on a machinist block to get the worst of the heat treating scale off. Then I'll clean up the bevels using a 100 micron 3M Gator Grit belt, which is good for this kind of work because it leaves fairly even scratches. Then I'll finish up using small sanding blocks, popsicle sticks, and so on to get everything smoothed out. I start with 320 grit to get rid of all the heat treating scale, then move to 600, then 1000 grit to finish. I make a line of semi-production tactical knives under my Tactics Armory brand, and I probably spend as much time just hand sanding this knife as the total amount of labor required to make one of my semi-production tacticals. And they're reasonably labor intensive. As always with Damascus steel, once you flatten it out, the pattern pretty much just hides in there. At long last, though, it is time to bring that pattern out. I'll immerse the blade in a dilute solution of ferric chloride and water. Hey guys, let me jump in real quickly to say that if you've enjoyed this or other knife builds on my channel, you can support the channel on Patreon. As with most of my builds, I'll have plans for this knife and its fittings with all the critical dimensions on my Patreon site. All my subscribers at any level have access to all the plans I've done over the years. So, link to Patreon in the cards and description. Alright, let's get back to work. After about half an hour, the pattern's nice and clear. The etch leaves a pretty heavy coating of oxides which need to be thinned out a little bit. So I'll go through essentially the same process that I did before, but just a little bit lighter this time. And here's the result of that process. Now, as we showed in the previous video, this build, in keeping with its Ka-Bar roots, has a guard and a pommel. These two items were quite a bit fancier in this build than in the original, of course, which used a stamped steel guard and a peened-on pommel. In the previous video, those two items were still extremely rough. In yet another video, I showed the full making of those two items. So obviously I'm not going to show the whole process, but basically it started with the forging of a big piece of twist Damascus, which was then chopped up so that the two pieces could be milled and ground to shape, which is where they are now. Also, a threaded nut has been welded to the bottom to accept a bolt which has been welded to the end of the tang. After that, they were then polished and etched and niter blued in bluing salts at about 275 degrees, which yielded this. So now we've got a handle, blade, and our two fittings. So we're about ready to assemble the final knife. Before we get there though, there's one last small detail. In order for the handle to mate cleanly, the original Ka-Bar has a small flat fashion so that it doesn't slop over the edges of the guard. After pre-assembling the knife and marking the location of the flat, I'll carefully sand it by hand on a machinist block, refinishing and blending it all back together so it looks nice and clean. Now we've got everything we need to assemble the blade. Key to assembling any knife, you gotta test that everything fits nice and tight, that everything lines up, and that you haven't messed up any of your clearances with glue, oxide, solder. There's nothing worse than starting to glue something together and finding halfway through that one of the parts won't fit through a hole or a thread's gotten gummed up or whatever. Fortunately, I've never done this myself, but I've heard of people who have. Because this assembly is complex, you don't want to use a really fast curing epoxy. Now, as the pommel is screwed down, it appears to have created a little hydraulic pressure inside the handle, which caused epoxy to squeeze out. Slow curing epoxy, in turn, leaves plenty of time for that squeeze out to just keep flowing and oozing and oozing and flowing. So, I spent a fair amount of time cleaning all the joints as the epoxy started to harden up. If I hadn't, there would have been quite a bit of epoxy caked all over the knife. But eventually we're done, and the epoxy is left to cure overnight. All that's left is to sharpen it up and admire. So this has been a really interesting, if somewhat time-consuming build. Now, this has been my first real project completion since the move to my new shop. Like I said, I've been in the throes of moving to a new shop for like 3 months, maybe even 4. So that's limited my video output for most of the beginning of this year. Fortunately, the new shop is all set up now, and I should be back to putting out actual knife builds again on a pretty regular basis. So thanks for sticking with me during this transition. All right, see you soon. Okay, so like I told you at the beginning of this whole process, there's a sting in the tail of this story, and that sting is, unfortunately, I cannot sell this knife. There's a small flaw. Most people probably wouldn't even see it, but I'd see it, and so I don't want it getting out in the world. So here's what happens. Here it goes. That is the end of that. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.